And I'm here with a very relaxed Arthur Sinodinos. In elections past, he wasn't quite this relaxed. As John Howard's long-term Chief of Staff, he was waiting nervously in the office in Parliament House while this drive occurred in the years 1998, 2001 and 2004, I think. I'll turn to Arthur now and get him to give us some ideas about exactly what it feels like on the inside of this sort of operation.
Well, Annabel, thanks first for having me on the program. It's a mixture of terror and excitement. The terror is there something that we've potentially done wrong? Is all the documentation okay for the Prime Minister to take to the Governor-General? You've got to make sure all of that is correct. And while there are senior people who work on that in the office, the Chief of Staff also has to make sure there's no bugbears or anything in any of that. What are the kind
of blunders you can make in the documentation to the Governor-General? Wrong date, wrong country?
You can put names in the wrong place. You can mix up how many executive councils there have to be. There has to be one to, if you like, close off on government business, and then a second one later on to do with the stuff to do with the proroguing of the Parliament and the like, which Ian is much more of an expert on. But you have to make sure all of the documentation is correct. You then have to make sure, more broadly in political terms, have we got our message right? Have we got our slogan, our tagline right? Are all the stars aligned? And honestly, until you hear the starters gun and get going, you won't have a feel for it. Some people love to get into the campaign. I always used to like to tick off every day. I just wanted to get to the end of it because there was so much suspense and it could be a real roller coaster ride. And I think you'll find this election will be a real roller coaster ride. We've got two leaders who've never fought a contest at this level before. No matter how experienced you are in politics, it's different when you are the leader. Howard used to say there's no other job in politics like being the leader of a political party. He was absolutely right. And so people in the Prime Minister's office will be waiting for Gillard to come back now. They'll be getting a prep for the press conference. They'll have thought through the main messages that she has to put up, but they'll also have to think of the questions she's going to be asked. And given the events of the last few days, the issues around Kevin Rudd, what deal was or wasn't made, who spilled the beans, those sorts of issues will come up. And even though people feel, well, that's a bit of a sideshow to the main thing, which is who do you want as your leader or Prime Minister, the fact is the Liberals will try and keep all of that stuff going because it deprives the Prime Minister of oxygen on the other issues where she believes she would be more on the front foot. I don't envy her task. She's very new to the job. She's only had a couple of weeks. She's had the odd stumble already. And now going into this campaign where she is carrying the hopes of the whole Labor movement on her shoulders, it'd be pretty daunting for anybody, I imagine.
Yeah, I want to know a little bit more about this first press conference that Julia Gillard will be staging shortly. I mean, how important is that opening statement in setting the tone of the campaign? I mean, if we have a look back at the last, let's say, 4 statements that have been made at the beginning of federal campaigns in 2007, there was a rather muddled effort by John Howard, I think, in that. You needn't necessarily comment on that. But the messages from the previous campaigns were pretty clear. In 2004, we heard who do you trust for the first time? Who do you trust on interest rates most significantly? That was John Howard, of course, facing up to Mark Latham. In 2001, another historically famous utterance, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances under which they come. 1998, I think, was something about call it for Australia or something along those lines. And 1996, when you were with John Howard but not Chief of Staff at that point, the slogan was for all of us, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. The first press conference, each of the leaders has to use it to set the tone for their campaign. What are their main messages to the public? In the case of Julia Gillard, she'll be talking, I think, about moving forward.
Do you think? Yes. I'm getting the sense that might be one of the
There's a bit of repetition in all this. Moving forward, about being good economic managers off the back of the GFC, taking the country forward in health and education, all the areas where Labor would perceive it has a strong story to tell vis-a-vis the coalition. The coalition will be saying, in effect, well, they're all talk and no action. If you want action, direct action, whether it's on climate change, on boat people, on keeping the economy strong, getting deficit and debts under control, then you have to vote for the coalition. Now, Tony Abbott is also using, I think, a speech, and Simon alluded to this earlier, a speech in Brisbane today, bury or cremate, inverted commas, work choices. I think he needs to keep inoculating on that ground, because that's obviously an area that the government will be hammering the coalition. Inoculation is very much part of the political weaponry at this time. As much as being on the positive side, you've also got to try and minimise your own negatives.
Sure, and while we're on the topic of inoculation, I guess Julia Gillard has a bit of inoculation to do in terms of former leaders of the party. I mean, Kevin Rudd in recent days has said that he proposes to make no further comment about the circumstances of his own execution, but that question hovers fairly heavily, doesn't it, in the ether? And you've also got the former Prime Ministers, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, staging a kind of an interesting double act in the background as well. How difficult will it be, in your opinion, for Julia Gillard to get clear of that?
Look, once the campaign proper starts and they're on the trail, both sides will be obviously wanting to focus on the positives and what they've got to offer. But in Julia's case, she will face a continued barrage of questions fueled by the opposition around the Rudd issue. Rudd does hang around the party a bit like Banquo's ghost, but it's also more complicated than that. You've had Faulkner say he's going to the backbench. You've got Tanner retiring from Parliament this election. So where the rubber hits the road in terms of the public is, what does this tell you about the likely makeup of the front bench of the Labor Party going into the next term if they're re-elected? And that's where the issue has some salience to the public. Is it a completely new government? Who are going to be in the great offices of state, whether it's defence, finance, foreign affairs? At the moment, it looks like Wayne Swan will stay in the Treasury. There's a question mark around Swan coming out of the whole mining tax imbroglio. He was seen as one of the main progenitors of that. That doesn't mean he'll be particularly popular even in his home state of Queensland. So there are some real questions over the makeup of the front bench, and the coalition will use those to deflect any questions about the experience or lack of experience of their own front bench. They will argue that they've got a number of senior front benchers who are senior ministers in government, so if the people want them to take over, they're ready to take over. Sure,
although Tony Abbott has his own slightly analogous situation in the Banquo's ghost figure of Malcolm Turnbull, to whom he has made a similar undertaking to the undertaking that Julia Gillard has reportedly made to Kevin Rudd, i.e. that he can look forward to a senior role in an Abbott government in cabinet. So how does he handle that, do you think?
Well, at this stage, Malcolm doesn't seem to be creating any trouble. The feedback I get is he's very busy trying to keep his seat in Wentworth. I think it's not in danger, but he will have to work hard to keep that seat. It's a very changeable seat. It's been changing over times in terms of its demographic and social composition. So he's got his hands full, and certainly to date he seems to be behaving. What we've had in recent days is a lack of discipline on the other side, and these comments either inspired in Washington or from Washington around what deal was done, and this has added fuel to the fire around the instability on Labor's front bench. So I think, in a sense, the shoe is on the Labor foot at the moment to try and get the Rudd issue settled once and for all.